Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to D News Plus. Today I'm Trace, and this week we're talking all about monsters. Where are they? Where'd they come from? And how they were built in nature and biology and in culture and history, and also what monsters we're going to be afraid of in the future. So far we've talked about monsters in nature and monsters in mythology, so make sure that you subscribe so you get all of those episodes, and go back and watch those too if you haven't already. But today we're going to talk about fictional monsters. This is one of the episodes in this series that I'm super excited about, because we know how nature creates monsters, even though it's really us and the predator-prey relationship. We also know how mythology has created monsters, and that's also kind of us. But this one is definitely us. This one we totally just built, and I love it. So first, one of the most famous monsters around, vampires. Vampires have been around for a long time. It's actually impossible to know exactly when the first vampire myth began. We do know that the monster came around long before the sparkly Pacific Northwest lame ones. The most famous vampire ever is Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's very famous. Some aspects of Stoker's Dracula did come from a person in history, specifically a Romanian prince from the 1400s named Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, or Vlad Tepes. Probably know him as Vlad the Impaler. Obviously, Tepes was not a blood-sucking monster. Western society put that image on him. There's all sorts of, debates based on that. But the idea of a human corpse returning from the dead to feast on the blood of the living, that comes from a long, long history of mythology and storytelling. A corpse returning from the dead comes from Slavic folklore. They're known as revenants. Makes the title of that movie make more sense now, doesn't it? One of the first uses of the word vampire, spelled with a Y, in English was in the London Journal in March of 1732. So let me switch to story mode here. It all stemmed from strange reports of an undead corpse terrorizing a small village in rural Hungary called Medregygia. I don't know how to pronounce it. Citizens demanded that recently deceased Arnold Paul's body be dug up because they thought that Arnold Paul, I don't know why, maybe because he had two first names or whatever, was the culprit of these terror attacks. The term they used to describe this monster stuck between life and death was vampire, with a Y, vampire. He'd been dead and buried for a month, and they dug up his body, and allegedly the body was fresh and undecayed, and it also had fresh blood in the body and around the mouth. Did you guys just get chills? I know, it's creepy. This is one of those stories of vampires that it's just so compelling, it makes you want to retell it to other people. But some of these stories come back to diseases or the conditions of the time. A disease called porphyria is sometimes known as the vampire disease. We'll come back to that later. But the idea of vampires could even have come earlier than Medregygia or porphyria diseases or anything like that. In ancient Egypt, vampires were maybe a deity or a demon. Ancient Egypt had hundreds of gods of the underworld. In China, they had Shang-Chi, which was like an Asian vampire. And there are different versions all over the world. We don't want to get too much of a list, going here, but they don't all even share the same characteristics that vampires generally have in the way that you probably are thinking. Some can see themselves in the mirror and some can't. Some turn into bats and some don't. Some turn into wolves or other animals. Sunlight or holy water kills some vampires while other vampires sunbathe. It's a terrible joke, producer Brian. Come on. That's not really true. The characteristic that seems to be in all of the versions of the vampire is they drink blood. Vampires are not the only ones after something in your body, however. There's also zombies. Zombies are very popular. Modern zombie popularity is credited to the movie from 1968, Night of the Living Dead, and its follow-ups. But the history of zombies goes way further back than that. It's actually a terrible time in world history where zombies started to become a thing, a time where people were kidnapped from Africa and forced into slavery. The word zombie may come from the Mitsogo language from Gabon. It's N-D-Z-U-M-B-I, Nzumbi, meaning corpse, or the Congo language, where it's spelled N-Z-A-M-B-I, Nzambi, meaning spirit of a dead person. In 1810, the English language got the word zombie when it was mentioned in the book History of Brazil. Zombie meant, for the English, basically a human who lost their soul or their self-awareness, which sounds terrible. The first American print was in a short story in a newspaper in 1838. And, you probably saw this coming, it was connected back to slavery. The zombie myth is actually traced back to the 17th and 18th century in Haiti, when it was ruled by France. They used slaves in sugar plantations, and it was extremely brutal. Half of the slaves brought to Haiti to work those plantations were worked to death. Slaves in Haiti thought that dying would bring them back to Africa, where they would be free. But they couldn't commit suicide because if they killed themselves, they wouldn't be allowed to return to Africa. Suicide would mean they'd roam their plantations for eternity as undead slaves, aka zombies. Slaves' worst fear was dying and still being a slave. In 1804 was the Haitian Revolution and the end of French colonialism. The myth of the zombie continued, however, and was adopted into the voodoo religion, where witch doctors could revive the dead and turn them into personal slaves. Again, drawing lines between the undead and becoming a slave against your will and dehumanizing certain people, and all of these things still have shadows in zombie stories today. Even some of the more out there zombie stories, for the most part, where a disease takes over your body and you don't become yourself. It's about dehumanization. It's not so much about the undead. It's about, I know these people, I recognize these people, and yet they're not who they were or should be. In 1915, the United States, or America, came to Haiti, and they tried to do away with the voodoo religion, and they ended up picking up the superstition of zombies along the way. The USA left the country in 1934, but in 1932, the first zombie movie was released, named White Zombie. Because historically, zombies were so connected to African culture, the studio wanted to specify that this wasn't about that. It was white zombies. That's awful. But anyway, pop culture zombies took off from there, and they've been part of our culture ever since. So that covers the undead living thing, part of zombies. What about eating brains, though? They want to eat your brains. As far as we can tell, actually, by our research, that started with the movie Return of the Living Dead in 1985. Previous to this, zombies would want to eat flesh, but never specifically brains. So this is a new thing. It's a millennial thing, 1985, brain eating. So we've got the undead that is a zombie. We've got the undead that is a vampire. But now we've got a bunch of different pieces of undead combined into one thing using science. So we get to see the beginnings of not mythology creating monsters, but science and engineering and industry. Frankenstein's monster was pulled from real life. In the 18th century, a scientist named Luigi Galvani did experiments with electricity and dead animals, trying to figure out how muscles worked. He would hook up electrodes to frog legs and use a tool that he could generate voltage. And then that would end up creating this movement in undead things, or they seemed to be undead. They were actually still dead. Sounds familiar, right? An author named Mary Shelley was alive during the Age of Enlightenment, and a lot of discussion was going on about the dissection of human bodies and about science and how it was starting to become more popular, and people were starting to understand how we worked a little more, and a lot of the subjects of these human dissections were dead criminals, although some scientists had to resort to grave robbing because in some places it was illegal to cut up human remains. She wrote all of this down in a book where she created this whole story around it in 1816. The reason that that's important is because that was known as the year without a summer. Because in Indonesia, a volcanic eruption had happened that had thrown so much ash into the atmosphere that it created a year-long winter. So in the summer, Mary and a bunch of her friends got together in a cabin in the middle of Europe to enjoy the summer and write stories for each other. And they passed the time, and that was the story she wrote, was the story of Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. Super interesting. She won their little competition that they had, and she ended up publishing the book, and now we have this scientifically undead-based monster. That's where that came from in pop culture. Werewolves are another big monster, and we haven't even touched on them yet. And they also kind of come from science, but not really, because they've been around for a lot longer. Lycanthropy has origins in ancient Greece and Celtic folklore, as well as stories from Africa and Asia, Middle East and North America. And examples are everywhere of, men transforming into beasts and back and forth. And some think that the origins could go back to rabies. The Blackfoot tribe talked about how people would go crazy and roam the woods after being bitten by a dog. Makes sense. Rabies is one of those things where it affects your brain and it can change who you are. There's also porphyria, which we mentioned a little bit earlier. It makes people go kind of crazy and it alters your appearance. Again, we're going to come back to it. Don't you worry. And they may even draw parallels between turning into a werewolf and, you ready for this? I don't think you're ready for this. Puberty. Think about it. Start growing hair in funny places. Start doing weird stuff. Body changes. There is, however, to bring it back to science for a minute, a real-life disease that will turn people into the appearance of a wolfman and many other diseases that resemble some of those famous movie monsters. And there's so much about this classic movie monster stuff that we didn't even get into. The history of werewolves and why you could become werewolves. You know, like that's like a whole episode that we could just do here on D News Plus. So let us know in the comments if that's something that you think we should do. Should we do like a whole series on werewolves? Because I'd totally be down. Let us know. Also, if you want to know more about monsters and the ones that nature makes, make sure to tune into Monster Week on Animal Planet starting Thursday at 9/8 Central. Should be really exciting. And make sure you subscribe so you get all the D News Plus right here on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any other questions, come find me on Twitter. I'm at Trace Dominguez. And thanks for watching.